Hello, my friends. Welcome back to this series, Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. Today, we are continuing our series on living in uncertain times. Where we left off, with our last video was on kindness. In fact, we talked about sacrifice, generosity, and kindness. Malcolm Gladwell once referred to kindness as the temporary suspension of indifference, and I find that concept quite captivating. And so one of the things that we get to wonder about is, how does one go about suspending indifference? Well, I'll give you some ideas of some techniques that you can practice here in a moment. The suspension, though, is actually all about mindset, more so than any technical skills I can teach. Now, don't get me wrong, the technical skills can help. Mindset, though, matters so much, and it takes practice, just like any mindset does. When you're taking up a new way of being, a new way of living, a new philosophy, what starts off as a struggle, like when you first learn to read, right? Every word is a challenge. When you first learned to ride a bike, right? Remember how challenging that was, or driving a car. And then after a while, with practice, it becomes like second nature. So too with these particular philosophies or mindsets, that once you begin to practice them, they increasingly become a part of who you are. So kindness really entails openness to the other. That's the first part of it. And yes, I appreciate this is also key to sacrifice and generosity as well. Actually attending to the other. One of the things that I've noticed when I'm in public places is how many people walk with their eyes downwards. And I'm not meaning to imply that they are downcast, like despondent or depressive or something like that. They're on their phones, or they're looking at the floor. They're not really attending to the other people around them. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to look up, look around. As you're walking through a group of people, be the one that is looking at about eye level to who other people are. Practice being aware of noting other people in your environment. And so sometimes brief eye contact can help. I've noticed in various cultures this does not always apply evenly, but here locally, at least in the mountains of Utah, just walking and making brief eye contact with people, and sometimes with a slight smile, that has struck up innumerable conversations with me. Just that one little thing of just being there, making eye contact, being available for that. Now, I appreciate many of us are stressed and busy, and therefore the last thing we need is to be inviting someone else to have a conversation with us. And yet I would say that the temporary suspension of indifference kind of requires that kind of contact. So again, if you're intending to live these particular philosophies, then become aware of others. G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "How much larger your life would be if yourself were smaller in it. You would awaken to open skies and streets full of splendid strangers," as an approximate quote. And so, how much larger would your life be if yourself were smaller in it? That's a question we'll ask several times in the series. So kindness. Suspend indifference by becoming aware of the other. It's harder then to allow the other to matter to you. That is a skill I don't know that I can teach. I can give some techniques on how to approximate that. But when you make eye contact with somebody, when you're there and you're observing and you're noting the people around you, then you can begin to appreciate that so many people around you are having their own experiences, their own subjective awarenesses, their own perceptions of the world. There's a word sonder, right? The awareness that other people have an inner life as rich and as varied as your own. And so when you begin to see other people and really encounter them as they are, then you can begin to suspend indifference. You can begin to endeavor kindness. So there's this idea that when we're endeavoring kindness, how do we come across as kindly? Well, one is, smiling, showing, not a manic grin necessarily, maniacal laughter. Instead, just a gentle smile, brief eye contact, being physically present, goes a long way towards that. But a large part of how it is that we communicate kindness to others is by genuinely listening to them. There's this notion that I've heard on and off again through the years. I remember first hearing it sometime in college. I'm not sure where this guideline came from, but it's like 40-60. That when you're talking and when you're engaged in a conversation with someone, that they get to do 60% of the talking and you get to do 40% of the talking, that you're listening 60% of the time and talking 40% of the time. And so some people, like therapists, can switch that over where their clients that they're working with do 90% of the talking and the therapist does 90% of the listening. However, in certain kinds of relationships, usually friendly relationships, collegial relationships, it's a matter of sharing equally, but disequally if you're endeavoring to be kind, that you do more listening than speaking. So this particular approach has worked really well. Like in college, I did sales for a while, and the 40-60 rule really helped me find out if the customer needed the product that I was selling and which version of the project that they needed. When I worked in food service as a waiter, the 40-60 rule worked really well, chatting with customers that customers felt connected with and cared for. And now, as a therapist, the 40-60 rule, I'm a little conversational. My therapy style is dialogical. It's very conversational. But even then, I do far more listening than talking. And then as a father, as a husband, as a friend, that I endeavor to listen more than I speak. And I'm getting better and better at this as I get older. And I would encourage you to do likewise. If you practice these skills of listening and talking, then other people will encounter you as caring. And that's important, that other people encounter you as a caring person. And I really hope that you genuinely are. And therefore, to communicate that. Something that we'll talk about in another video is how to talk in such a way that when it is your turn to talk, that you can better show that you are talking about and talking with the other person, not one person talking in one way and another person talking in another. For example, when I'm working with couples, there is this tendency of topic switching. It's remarkable. Like a husband and wife will sit down and she will start talking about, okay, here's what's going on, here's what happened last week. And then she'll finish speaking. And then he will start with, well, here's what happened at work. Okay, now we've got two topics. We've got topic A, what happened to her last week at work. And now we've got topic B, what happened to him at work last week, right? They're not talking about the same thing. So even though they're both talking, and even if they're both following the 40-60 rule, it's not really very kind. And so one of the things that I teach is a concept called stick to topic A. Topic A is the first topic in a given conversation. So if my sweetheart comes in and she sits down and she's telling me about some of the stresses in trying to teach a particular concept in chemistry, she teaches chemistry. And as she's trying to share that with me, and if I go, oh my gosh, you think that's tough. I tried to teach dialogical phenomenology to a bunch of undergraduates and blah, right? We're now talking about two different things. There's her experience teaching this particular difficult concept in chemistry, and then there's my experience teaching this particular sticky concept in psychology and philosophy. So sticking to A is sticking with the first topic that was introduced. So she comes in, she's talking to me about this particular stress that she has in teaching this chemistry subject. So therefore, we get to talk about her stress teaching this chemistry subject. And then as we've talked about that for a little while, again, I'm doing more listening than speaking, but when I am speaking, it's about the topic at hand, topic A, stress in chemistry teaching. And then after that winds down and she's had a chance to express herself, then I can say, oh, and honey, I can really relate to you because here's this thing that happened when I was trying to teach some undergraduate students phenomenological psychology. And so it's when A is resolved or A has been discussed sufficient that then you can transition to topic B. Right? And even then, you can still practice the 40-60 rule, even though topic B may be the topic that you're introducing. And so if you're endeavoring kindness, then one technique I would like you to start with is try to practice the 40-60 rule a little bit. That's hard for those of us that are very talkative. Surprisingly enough, it's hard for those of us that tend to be quiet, because then you've got to speak more. so the other person knows that you're actually listening and participating in the conversation. Okay. So I can remember, oh, it's been some time ago. I was at a social gathering, a little party with some colleagues, and a new colleague came in, and she sat down, and I was sitting on one end of a couch, and my sweetheart was sitting next to me, and this new colleague comes in, and she sits down, and she talks to me for a little while. My sweetheart gets up and sees a friend and walks off. So I'm talking to this new colleague, and she spoke to me for a good 30 minutes straight, and I'm just smiling and nodding. And then she gets up and says, that was a great conversation. Thank you. So sometimes just sitting quietly and demonstrating active, attentive listening is still participating in a conversation, right? The trick is, for those of us where I don't tend to be shy, but for those of you who do tend to be shy, to demonstrate that you are actively, attentively listening. Okay, we'll get into some listening skills here in another video in more detail. For today, though, it's be there, still participate in the conversation. You may need to speak up a little bit more so the other person knows that you're tracking, following, and that you're still talking about the topic at hand. So there's another technique I'd encourage you to try to use, and that's called reflective listening. It's also known as like listening with the third ear. What are we really talking about? So my sweetheart comes in, and she's talking about her stress in teaching a particular chemistry concept. If I am hearing, old Dr. D, I want you to solve my problem teaching chemistry, then I'm not really listening to her, because she's not talking to me about my solution to her problem. She is talking to me about her stress relative to her problem. That's the subject at hand, her stress about her problem. So if I come in and I am in fix-it mode, then I'm not actually sharing a conversation with her. I'm talking about something else, which is my solution to her problem, not her problem. And so this is really tricky when you're listening with the third ear, especially those of us who like to fix problems or like to try to fix problems. And that is, what are we really talking about? A dear friend of mine has a child on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. I know there's a lot of spectra now. Has a child on the autism spectrum, and remarkably high functioning, delightful child. And he calls and he's very stressed out and is asking me for advice on what to do, having raised an autistic child myself, how to go about how he as a father can raise his autistic child, father to father, how we can go about that. The topic at hand, though, when you start listening with the third ear, is his stress and his worry and his love for his child, not what parenting skills I developed to help my child, because even though my child and his child share spectrum dynamics, they're still two different kids, and any one child on the spectrum is as different from other child on the spectrum as they are from people not on the spectrum on average. So therefore, it can be a little tricky if I just say, well, just do this thing I did. Now, see, that's not really what we're talking about. Now I've switched the topic to topic B. Here's my solution to your problem. When, yes, he's asking for advice. What he's really talking about is his heartache, his love, frustration, his stress, his hope, right? That's what's really at the table. And it takes practice to listen with a third ear like that. And yes, we won't always get it right. I don't always get it right. However, that's when we know we're connecting to the topic at hand. Topic A. A friend calls, stressed out about a situation in the marriage, really worried. What they're talking about is the situation in their marriage. That's the topic. They're not talking to you about your solution to their problem. You've switched the topic if you start talking solutions. Instead, what you do is you address the topic at hand. One of the things you'll find is that far more often than not, when you address the topic at hand, stress about chemistry teaching, concern and worry about raising a child on the spectrum, difficulties in a marriage, when you are listening and talking about those feelings and those experiences, oftentimes advice isn't needed or even warranted. That because you've actually talked about what's really going on, then you switching the topic to a solution is less than helpful. Therefore, when you talk about what's really going on in the depth that the person you're speaking to requires or would really like, then there's no solution necessary. What they were seeking for when they came to you was connection, not solution. So practice listening with the third ear. And for those of you that tend not to jump in and give advice, great. you still get to ask yourself, what are we really talking about here? What is really the core issue here? What is the core of this particular conversation? And that's what you talk about. And please ask if you don't know. I do this regularly. Hey, is this what we're talking about? Are we talking about this thing, or are we talking about the other thing, right? And so when my kids come to me and they'll be talking about work or school or relationships, and sometimes I'll just stop and say, okay, it sounds like we're talking about this, or I'll give some other kind of indication that, okay, it sounds like this is what's going on. And not infrequently, they correct me. My students, my colleagues, my clients. And that corrective, and then me participating in the corrective, is what can really help keep us connected as we continue to talk. Okay, so stick to topic A, listen with the third ear. Ask yourself, what are we really talking about? Endeavor not to switch the topic to topic B until topic A has been thoroughly addressed. The other thing, and this is a growth area for me, and I'm not the best at it, still practicing, is something that my colleagues have very caringly confronted me about through the years, and that is listening to understand, not listening to respond. And we'll talk about this more in another video. But sometimes as somebody is talking, we're already formulating our response to the point where when they finish, we're already responding. And what I found is I have this tendency to cut people off. So there's a technique my old supervisor David taught me many, many years ago of take a breath, count to 3. Like if somebody else is listening and they seem to be done, just 1, 2, 3. And if they don't go on, then you can jump in and say, hey, it sounds like you're talking about this, right? Is this what's going on with you? Okay, just learning to take a beat. So how do we suspend indifference? By way of review, one is awareness. Look around. Try as you're walking. Yes, our phones are important, and yes, we're busy, but try to look around, right? Put your phone in your pocket. Make eye contact with those who make eye contact. Have a gentle smile on your face. Be there, be a warm presence. So number 2 is also allow other people to matter to you, that other people are having just as rich an inner life as you are. In terms of how you practice that in conversation, try to follow the 40-60 rule, right? Listen more than you speak. Another thing is stick to topic A. Whatever topic somebody approaches you about, stick to that topic until it's been addressed. With that, you can listen with the third ear. What are we really talking about? Right? And then talk about that. Is it a thought? Is it a feeling? Is it an idea? And talk about that. Right? And then endeavoring, especially for those of us that are very talkative, to take a small beat between the time somebody else finishes their sentence and then when we begin to talk. So thank you for joining me for this extension of our series, Living in Uncertain Times. I really appreciate you joining me. I'm old Dr. D. We'll see you in the next video.